Okay, so this is a little midweek session to jump back to development to look at a specific policy, which is joint ventures, and apply this through examples from China, where the main joint venture strategy is being employed. Joint ventures need to be explained, so we'll look at that in terms of the benefits and how it works, and the evaluation is to the extent to which they are beneficial for an LADC. We'll also look at it just in terms of the multinational corporation that's involved in that as well. The information relates to page 28 in your booklets, so if you pause this now and just read that information, and we'll go through the notes and the analysis in a second. Okay, so brief overview. So we've got our development problems, which we've looked at previously, and then we've got solutions, either the free market, so our right-leaning economists, Hayek, Friedman, etc., and then the interventionist approach, Keynes, Krugman, Stiglitz, who favour some government intervention. The free market ones we've looked at, so in terms of Washington Consensus or the WTO, and broadly market liberalisation in terms of privatisation, deregulation, free trade or trade liberalisation, and specifically financial market liberalisation. Alongside that, in terms of the market liberalisation, tends to be austerity policies, so governments being less involved in markets, and this in itself increasing FDI. But FDI has various costs and benefits, and some developing countries feel that the costs outweigh the benefits. So there is a different approach through an interventionist strategy, which is controlled FDI to try to increase the benefits to a developed country. So it's a form of regulation that a developing country would put in place, which means that if you want to invest within a country, then you need to do so on the terms which that country sets. And the specific terms is that you must join with a domestic business to manufacture in that country. So just jumping back to the problems for a second. So if we analyse with the Harrod-Doerr models, a lack of savings within the domestic economy reduces the lack of capital available for businesses to loan, and therefore in terms of financial capital, that would mean that physical capital would be low within that country. That would lead to lower gross national incomes and the lower value of output, so that would reinforce a poverty trap, which would be self-reinforcing over the long term and hold a country back in terms of its growth and its development. We've looked at specific problems like primary dependency being part of this based on low incomes, lack of government spending or finance for the government to spend, but also the lack of an access to finance for businesses to borrow. And one way we said that this investment could happen through an external source of finance was foreign direct investment, so to inject directly into the investment, and that to positively increase the model. The form that China took is what was called a joint venture. So a foreign business that wants to enter the Chinese market, so a multinational company, would invest a significant amount, so 70%, into a joint venture company. So this is a separate company, this isn't a merger, and then a smaller domestic firm would invest 30% into this joint venture, and they effectively get 30% of the profits. So 30% investment from the domestic firm, the Chinese firm, 70% from a foreign firm, possibly the United States, and then the profits are shared in that ratio as well. There are specific agreements though that are said. One of them is this is effectively a separate company, so it's not something that is legally part of the other companies, it's a separate entity, but there are some agreements and restrictions on what those partners can do, and this is the part that regulates. So there is a regulation in terms of the ratio, and there is also a regulation in terms of the actions of the firm. So this is China trying to allow investment, but to control that investment, but also to benefit domestic businesses. In terms of the scale of this, well, this is just over time. So from 97, 2002, just before the financial crisis, then just after the financial crisis. So significant amounts, around 20 billion a year of joint venture FDI into China. This is just one example, which is the car market. So significant international car firms here, Volkswagen being one of the largest car manufacturers in the world, General Motors, Hyundai, Nissan, and so on, and it's showing the amount of foreign car manufacturers that have joint ventures with domestic Chinese manufacturers, so allowing Volkswagen to significantly manufacture cars within China. Interestingly, Volkswagen has two partners. Don't know who those companies are, SAIC and FAW, but also General Motors has a partnership with that company as well. So the company is getting the benefit of expertise from General Motors and Volkswagen is getting the benefit to enter the Chinese market. So broad reasons for joint ventures. The international businesses gain local markets, knowledge, resources and partners with the culture and language. It allows minimizing of costs. Also, it gets past the legal restrictions that China puts in place. So the Chinese companies or the Chinese government makes it mandatory in certain industries in terms of what foreign investment can take place, and there's the specific industries that China is currently controlling FDI into, so car manufacturing, finance and insurance, telecoms, media and mining activities. Looking at the benefits for China more widely, you can see the blue line is the average in terms of Chinese firms within that industry, the joint ventures Chinese partner by themselves, and then the productivity that the joint venture gives. So the implication there is that through that expertise from the multinational corporation in terms of training the skills of their staff, the specialism of their physical capital, but also potentially their processes, this is making those joint ventures more productively efficient than other competing Chinese firms. So this is the little bit of specific notes to take down. So what are the benefits to the multinational company in green and the less economically developed country, and what are the negatives or the evaluation to the extent to which? So initially there is internal and external economies of scale. So the two businesses coming together would be a greater scale, but also there will be external factors that that company gives the international business, the domestic firm, in terms of the knowledge and the cultural differences within China. It also allows that multinational firm access to lower costs of production in China. So the Chinese market has lower cost of production than competitor markets, and it also gives them access to the Chinese market, which is significantly growing over time and a significantly large market. It's GDP putting it as one of the top economies globally. Lastly, there is a favourable regulatory framework within China that encourages FDI. In terms of the costs of the multinational company, there could potentially be loss of intellectual property or competitive advantages, comparative advantage. So in this case, or in a case of motor manufacturing, it could be a specific electrical engine design. It could be the processes involved in training staff. This may then lead to that competitor in future coming back and stealing market share globally, and also there's a small diminishment of profits as the share the profits are shared between the two entities. In terms of the benefits of the less economically developed country, well, there'll be increased training for domestic staff. So the joint venture has to have employment from domestic staff. It will increase the quality of physical capital because that joint venture will have new and better physical capital, as evidenced by that productivity gain. It's an injection of a significant amount of foreign financial capital through FDI, and then, like I mentioned, the productivity gains. The minimizing factors, so it's highly likely that most of this joint venture will be beneficial, but 70% of those profits of that joint venture will leave the country. So domestic spending on cars, which are produced in that joint venture, but 70% of that profits go abroad. It may be in certain capital intensive industries rather than labour intensive, so that might minimise the benefits. Car manufacturing, while large scale, is still quite capital intensive. And even that foreign multinational company might gain some information that they can exploit in the future. So potential that the Chinese firm may be the more innovative, and the multinational company might gain an advantage from that. One just little thing to think about is that the similarities and differences between joint ventures and FDI. So they are both a type of FDI, they are both foreign direct investment. However, FDI in itself would be 100% investment from the foreign multinational and 100% of the profits leaving, whereas the joint venture minimises that through the regulation in terms of the structure and the profits. FDI is really a free market policy, whereas joint ventures is partially interventionist to try to control the FDI and trying to direct it towards industries that that country wants to gain an advantage in. You have this as a little activity towards the end of that sheet, and it gives you 3 examples there. I wasn't aware when I created this that Huawei was going to become such a big topic in the UK, but it is one of the companies that China has over time targeted to try to gain comparative advantages. I tried to find a South American version, as South America is another significant area of less economically developed countries, and I found the Brazilian version of Samsung, which really isn't known outside of Brazil, but they produce lower quality unbranded computer hardware within that market. And then I just thought I'd go for a big Indian company in terms of Tata. So if you want to pause this for a second, have a quick look at those different potential joint ventures. Think about China, Brazil, India. Which country do you think would benefit most from a joint venture and why? Then secondly, if you were Google and you are going to spend money on a joint venture to enter one of these markets, who would you invest in, which country and why? And then lastly, there's very little information here. What types of information might you want to be able to make a stronger judgment on those 2 questions? So this is a technique in terms of evaluation that, depending on a question, could be open to you, and especially if there is a question where you're not clear how you could make a judgment. So one way in which you can evaluate is just to look at what information you don't know that you would need to know to be able to make a judgment. Okay, so pause this for a second, have a think about those. Bearing in mind there isn't really a right or a wrong answer for this, it's just the process of thinking about which decision you would make and why. Okay, so potential ways in which you could approach this. You could look at it in terms of the industry. So China, in terms of moving from manufacturing to higher value tertiary or higher value manufacturing, may benefit that country in terms of moving itself to the next stage of development. So China actually becoming a fully developed economy would depend on the great majority of jobs being higher paid. You might look at India in terms of where they are in terms of HDI, so they are less developed than China, and say that that may have the most significant impact here in terms of taking people on very low incomes to slightly higher incomes. So that might be a scale one. You'd probably argue that it wouldn't impact on Brazil, as again Brazil are the most developed per capita out of the three countries here. If you were to look at which country you would invest in if you were Google and why, in terms of government intervention or closer to the free market, you're looking at Brazil and Tata. You might look at both of those as being favourable to the US at the moment, in terms of the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, has a very good relationship with Donald Trump, so there might be favourable to a deal between those two economies. Again, Modi in India, trying to seek positive relations with America. Possibly it would be likely to be blocked at this moment in time with the kind of continuing trade war with China and the US, especially around security issues around Huawei. So it may not make sense for Google to do that. However, in terms of the companies, probably the one that Google would most likely benefit from in terms of advanced technology would be Huawei. Things you may want to know or have a stronger judgment on, it may be the predictions or the forecasts for economic growth in these countries. China is still on its path in terms of rapid growth. Brazil has some warning signs around its economy in terms of inflation. The Indian economy again has some significant structural issues that aren't being fully addressed. But it also may be things like the skill levels in that country, which trade deals they have if you are going to export from those countries, potentially things like corporation tax. If you are taking 70% of the profits, at what level will they be taxed?